Hope it works. Yeah. Randy and I have spent a great deal of time trying to figure out how to get this PowerPoint presentation going up there so that you can see what's going on. And earlier today it was going a little bit better than it is right now. So I'm just stalling until that first slide comes up there. Hopefully it'll be just a couple seconds now. Well, there we are. And so we begin our overview of the Old Testament. And let me start with a simplified view of the Old Testament. We're going to be coming back to this again next week. The Old Testament covers a period of about 4,000 years, if you use Bishop Ussher's strict chronology of the age of people and when they had children and when they begat and known historical events. Creation works out to about 4004 BC. And the Old Testament covers about 4,000 years of history. And I've divided it up into two categories. Pre-Israel. And pre-Israel actually covers about 2,000 years of that 4,000-year history. And just for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to go through this as I did when I covered the book of Genesis, but pre-Israeli history concerns itself, first of all, with creation, the corruption of both the race and the universe, and then the establishment of countries, all in preparation for Israel's history. The rest of the Old Testament concerns itself with the nation of Israel. Now, if you have 929 chapters in the entire Old Testament, that's a lot. And you've memorized most of them, right? If you have 929 chapters in the Old Testament, and only 11 of those chapters concerns itself with pre-Israel history, what do you think that God is saying about the importance of the part that covers Israel? It's just a law of hermeneutics. And for those of you who don't know what hermeneutics is not a fellow that lived down the street from me. It is the art and the science of biblical interpretation. And one of the principles of biblical interpretation is if the Bible devotes a tremendous amount of material to a certain event or person, or in this case, the nation of Israel, it must be important. So out of the 929 chapters in the Old Testament, 918 of those pertain to Israel's history. Now, why am I making this so important? You'll discover why as we go along, but initially I would like to say that there are Christians out there, and they are our brothers and sisters, who think that God is not going to fulfill the promises that he gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because the people that came from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, namely Israel, crucified the Messiah, and God feels no obligation to, because of that, to fulfill his promises. And therefore, all of the promises and the prophecies in the Old Testament need to be reinterpreted, because it's just not going to happen as Israel was expecting it to happen. And I would like to submit to you that God did not waste a bunch of trees to publish all of that material, because Israel's history and Israel's future is unimportant. Now, as we look at Israel's history in the Old Testament, it's going to be covered under 7 periods. The first period will be that of the patriarchs. That's just a word that refers to fathers. And who are the patriarchs? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and in a sense, Joseph, which covers most of the book of Genesis. But with that period, there is also this assumed 400 years, because when you finish up Genesis, where are the patriarchs living? They've gone to Egypt because there was a famine in the land. And Joseph is prime minister, and that's where they are being housed. Think of it this way. They are not yet a nation. They are just a family of 75 people as of this point. And they are, in a sense, in the womb of Egypt, in the embryonic stage, until they grow into at least 2.8 million people and become a nation. And God will, through a man named Moses, bring them out of the womb of Egypt, and they will be born as a nation, which is our next period, which is the Exodus. Now, the Exodus is not just about bringing them out of Egypt. It also includes 40 years of wandering in the Sinai Peninsula, because they did not trust God to bring them into the promised land, the land that he had promised to give to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. The next period is the conquest, which follows their wanderings, in which Joshua, the new leader, takes them into the land of Canaan, and for the most part, conquers and drives out the Canaanites so that they can settle in the land. But after Joshua dies, and there was no single central leader, and there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes, and we enter the period of the Judges. And we go through these cycles in Judges where Israel starts to mingle with the people in the land that they refuse to drive out completely or to destroy. They end up worshiping their gods. They're unfaithful to Yahweh, the God of Israel, and God has to punish them by subjugating them to one of the nations that is still in the land or still nearby. And after a while, they start crying, "Wah!" And God hears their cry, and he sends them a deliverer whom we call Judges. Some of the more famous ones are Ehud and Gideon and Jephthah, and I guess the most famous one of all, Samson. So, Samson and I have a lot in common. I don't think either one of us had any muscles. I think his power came from God, not from weightlifting. All right. The last of the judges really is the prophet Samuel. And the people do not like being subjugated to the Philistines. And they want a king that can lead them out into battle. So they go to Sammy and say, "Sam, we want a king. All the other nations have a king. We want to be not different. We want to be like the other nations." And so they get a king. And so we enter the period of Israel's history that we call the monarchy, because they have kings. And there'll be a united monarchy for the first three kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. And then the kingdom splits up north and south, Israel and Judah, and there will be a divided monarchy. That lasts about 4.5 centuries, and then they just get further and further and further away from God and the worship of Yahweh and the adherence to the law of God. And God finally says, my house, my rules, and if you want to stay here, you're going to have to do things my way or find someplace else to live. And he throws them out of the land for a 70-year exile into the land of Babylon, after which they are, or at least a remnant of them, return. And that's Israel's history in a nutshell. And we'll get into some more detail as we go along. Now, why are we doing an overview of the Old Testament? Basically because I'm angry. I don't know, you do things when you're angry, funny things. Yeah. I had a girlfriend one time who, when she got angry, and this would never occur to me to do, I promise, I am certifiably sane, she would clean house. She would get so mad she would clean house. And she would call me up at 2:30 in the morning and say, guess what I've been doing? Cleaning house, and now you're keeping me awake. I'm angry. I'm angry about biblical ignorance. For those of you who have known me for any length of time at all, I can't stand it that people who sit in church pews know so little about this book that God has given us that reveals his person and his plan for our lives. Before I married this girl in pink back here, I dated a girl who lived in Shelby County, and she was an educated girl, very, very cute and very fun to be with, and I was with her for about a month and a half. And one day she says to me, I got a new job. I started a new job this week. She had entered into the legal profession. And she says, and I'm learning all kinds of new vocabulary. I says, really? For instance, she says, sodomy. I never knew what sodomy was before. And I'm thinking, this is an educated woman. And now she's working for lawyers, prosecutors even. And I said, well, I don't want to make her feel dumb. I says, do you know where that term comes from? And she says, no. I says, that came from the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible. Now, folks, I would not date anybody who did not go to church, and not just any church, but a good church every week, and she was going to a Baptist church. She says, even when I'm sick, I do not miss church. She goes, what's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah? So I explained the story to her. And I says, and that's the first place the Bible talks about homosexuality. And she goes, the Bible talks about homosexuality? That was our last date. I was having a discussion at work one time, and we tease each other constantly. And one of the girls, formerly a pastor's wife, was making fun of my bald head. Can you believe I'm bald? I says, you better be really careful about making fun of bald men of God, because I might just call a couple of bears in here and tear you up. She goes, what? What's that got to do with the Bible? I says, you know the story about Elisha, the prophet, when they were making fun of his bald head. He cursed some young fellas, and a couple of female bears came out of the woods and tore him up. She goes, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I says, you're not serious, right? You were a pastor's wife and you don't know that story? She goes, you're telling me that's in the Bible. I says, yeah, that's in the Bible. So I took her to 2 Kings, and Elijah has just been taken up in a chariot, and Elisha is walking up the road. And as Elisha was going up on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, go away, Baldy. Go away, Baldy. And he turned around, and when he saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. And 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore up 42 of the boys. That's 2 Kings chapter 2. Friends, biblical ignorance, especially for people who have been Christians for years and years and years, bothers me. So that's one of the reasons we're going over the Old Testament, is because I think that most people in Christian churches today are not familiar with the stories to which are referred in the New Testament by Jesus and by the apostolic writings. We need to know these stories, or we will not know the point that the New Testament writers are making. People don't see the particular stories. Not only that, people don't see the plan. Where do you go? I mean, Jesus, he was an afterthought, right? Wasn't he? I mean, really, was it God's plan all the time to crucify Jesus Christ? Or was that just something that happened? Peter says in Acts chapter 2, Jesus was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. This was in the mind of God, because Christ is the Messiah, the Lamb of God who was crucified from the foundation of the world. This plan took place in the mind and the counsel of God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, before creation ever took place. Before the first sin had even happened, God said, I am going to show these people how much I love them. And God demonstrates his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, his enemies, Christ died for us. In the very next chapter, in a separate sermon, Peter says, God foretold by the mouth of all the prophets. Where do we find the prophets? What prophets is Peter talking about? He's talking about the Old Testament. Every single one of the prophets, from Moses all the way forward, foretold that the Christ, the Messiah, should suffer. And this was a problem for the Jews. Paul says that a crucified Christ is a stumbling block for Jews, because all they concentrated on were the prophecies in the Old Testament that said when the Messiah comes, he's going to restore our fortunes, he's going to restore the kingdom under the boundaries that we had under Solomon, and he is going to do away with our enemies. And that's all they could see. But there are plenty of verses in the prophets that demonstrate that the Messiah, when he comes, should suffer. Also, people don't see the prophecy. Folks, there's waning interest in end times instruction in the Church of God. Very few people have a sense of the immediacy of Christ's return, that it could happen any moment, and that we need to be ready so that we do not cower in shame at his coming. But when I grew up in the faith decades ago, maybe centuries ago, a sense of the imminent return of Jesus Christ was always on our minds. We were always talking about it. We were singing songs. Maybe today my Lord will come. You know, we were always singing songs and having discussions about what was coming in the future when Jesus Christ returned. Everybody's interested in what's going to happen to his life. I had a girl come to me one time, and she had been dating a couple guys, and they both proposed to her on successive nights. And she said, Pastor, Bob and Mike have both asked me to marry him. She said, who's going to be the lucky guy? I thought for a second. I said, you're going to marry Bob, and Mike is going to be the lucky guy. But everybody seems to be going to fortune tellers and everything like this. If you want to know what the future is like, you got to go to God. And I can promise you this. Everybody thinks that the future is found in the book of Revelation. No, Revelation just fills in some details about events that have already been discussed in the Old Testament. You want the key to understanding the end of things, then you have got to be familiar with the Old Testament prophecies. And guess what? They all pertain to Israel. Everything else fits into a framework that concerns God's plan for the nation of Israel. Is it only for Israel? No. But Israel and Jesus Christ are the central characters. And people don't see the prophecy. I saw in the night visions, Daniel says, behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. What was Jesus' favorite way of referring to himself? Son of man. And how's he coming? At the end, he's coming with the clouds. And John says in Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye shall see him. And there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, that's God the Father, and was presented before him. And we see a picture of this in Revelation chapter 4 and Revelation chapter 5, when the Lamb of God makes an appearance before the throne and is handed the scroll. And to him was given dominion and glory and kingdom, that all peoples and nations and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall never pass away, and his kingdom one that shall never be destroyed. And then Daniel in chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, gives us the framework in which all of future prophecy fits together. And that perspective I will cover briefly this morning. He starts out in verse number 24. He says, 70 weeks are decreed concerning your people. Now, the word that's used in Hebrew is not the word for weeks. It's just a word that means sevens. 70 sevens, 70 groups of 7 years are decreed for your people. Who was Daniel? Daniel was a Jew. Who are Daniel's people? They are the Jewish people. And your holy city. What is the Jewish holy city? That is Jerusalem. So this is a very specific prophecy. As far as God is concerned, there is a period of 490 years. In case some of you have pulled out your calculator, 70 groups of 7 years is 490 years concerning the future of the Israel people. And it's going to accomplish 6 things. To finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity. Who did that? Jesus Christ. When did he do that? On the cross. And immediately after that, he brought in his kingdom and established himself on the throne, right? No, he did not. Look at the next 3 things. After he atones for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness. That's a term that the Jews would be familiar with concerning the millennial kingdom. The kingdom that when Jesus Christ comes back, he is going to establish. To seal up both vision and prophet. What does that mean? That means no more prophecy or visions are going to be given after that time, because you won't need it. Because the king is here, we can see him. If we've got a question, we can just walk up and ask him. And to anoint a most holy place. That is a holy of holies in a temple that will exist during the time that Christ is reigning on the earth. So you get the idea. This is the introductory verse to this framework in which all prophecy, or all of the future, pertains. There is a period of 490 years, described as 70 weeks. We call this the 70 weeks prophecy. All right, in the next verse, in verse number 25, Gabriel, who's saying these things to Daniel, continues, know then and understand. Folks, don't miss those words. Don't take this stuff lightly. God wants us to understand what is coming in the future. Know then and understand that from the going out of a word or a decree to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince comes, Okay, he's given us a definite period for these 490 years, or 70 weeks of years. It starts when a certain decree is given, and it ends, or at least a portion of it ends, when Messiah the Prince comes. Until that time shall be 7 weeks, or a period of 49 years, and 62 weeks. Now, for those of you who have gotten out your calculator, what is 7 weeks plus 62 weeks? That's 69 weeks. 69 groups of 7 years, and they are continuous. The streets shall be built again, and the wall even in times of affliction. In other words, Jerusalem will be rebuilt again. Now, you got to understand, Daniel is prophesying and recording this after 586 BC. What happened in 586 BC? Nebuchadnezzar came into Jerusalem and he destroyed the city and he destroyed the temple. Understand? And God says it's going to be rebuilt. Let me see if I can get this in outline form for you. In the past, we have a group of 7 weeks followed by a group of 62 weeks, which makes 69 weeks of years. That's 483 years. So from the time that this decree goes out that says, you Jews go back and rebuild that city, until Messiah shows up in Jerusalem, is 483 years. Now we know when this decree took place. Artaxerxes, who was the king that Nehemiah served, and we can see this in chapters 1 and 2, gave a decree that they should go back and to restore the city of Jerusalem. The decrees before that pertained to going back and rebuilding the temple, but this one pertains to rebuilding the city. And when did that take place? 444 BC. And if the Jews had any sense, and if they had understood this, they would have been able to calculate the day that Jesus Christ came into Jerusalem, and guess what day it works out to be? Palm Sunday, just a few days before he is crucified on a cross. So in the past, we have segment number 1 of 49 years and 434 years, which makes 69 weeks of years. Now, the next verse. Then after the 62 weeks, and the 62 weeks came after what? After the 7 weeks. So what Gabriel is really saying is, after the 69 weeks, after 483 years, after, that's the end of the week, after the 69th week is closed, the anointed one, the Messiah, will be cut off. The Hebrew word for cut off is often used of a person who is executed because of a crime. And Jesus Christ was executed as a common criminal, wasn't he? So what happens after Jesus shows up on Palm Sunday? After that 69th year, or 69th week, after that 483rd year, which ends with Palm Sunday, the Messiah is executed on a cross. And he shall have nothing. Did you see that? Well, what did he come for? He came to save his people from their sins. He came to be the Redeemer of Israel. How'd that work out? They rejected him. He did not get the nation. He did not get set on a throne. He did not establish a kingdom. After his crucifixion, what's he got? As far as the Jewish expectation is concerned, he's got nothing. All right. Now, it's going to get a little, put your thinking caps on type time now. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and its sanctuary. Now, when does this take place? This takes place after the 69th week. Well, you'll say, well, that takes place during the 70th week. No. The 70th week, which is the last group of 7 years, has not started yet. In the next verse, we're going to see what starts that last group of 7 years. So after the 69th week is over, Jesus is crucified. What else happens? The city, that's Jerusalem, and its sanctuary, the temple, are destroyed. We know when that happens. It's 70 AD, when the Roman army comes in and destroys the city and the temple. And without the temple, guess what stops? Sacrifices. No more sacrifices, because the Jews can sacrifice only in one place, and that is the temple. And it has to be in Jerusalem, and it has to be in a particular spot in Jerusalem. And you know what's there right now? The Dome of the Rock, the Mosque of Omar. It's that Muslim religious structure. And if anybody tries to damage it, all of the Arab nations and Muslim nations will converge on Israel, and there will be a war like you've never seen before. So they leave it alone. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there will be war and desolations. Now, it is not unusual for there to be a gap in prophecy. You remember the 6 things that were going to happen during these 70 weeks. And right after it says, and sin will be atoned for, it says, and then he will establish righteousness. The kingdom of righteousness has not come, but it's all just one enduring run-on sentence. And this is not unusual. Jesus was asked to be a guest speaker in his hometown at the synagogue in Nazareth. Homeboy has come back home. Let's give him an opportunity to speak. So he opens up the scroll and he turns to Isaiah 61. And he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good tidings to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, and to proclaim liberty to the captives, and to the opening of the prison, and to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. He rolls up the scroll and he says, that's been fulfilled in your hearing. But Jesus did not finish the sentence. It goes this way. The opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, when God destroys all of Israel's enemies. Has that happened? No, there's an obvious gap there. And Jesus demonstrates that gap by stopping in the part that has been fulfilled. And so we have in the same thing back in Daniel chapter 9, in the present, we have a gap. And the gap, after the 69th week is over and Messiah is executed and has nothing, we have the city is destroyed, and the temple is crushed, and sacrifice ends. Now, here comes the last week. You remember that prince of the people who came and destroyed the city? It does not say that the prince destroyed the city. It said the people of that prince came and destroyed the city. What city? Jerusalem. Now, that prince cannot be the Messiah. It can't be Jesus Christ. Because why would Jesus Christ's people destroy the city of Jerusalem and the temple? They're not. And it didn't say that the prince of the people who destroyed it, because he's a future entity. And Daniel has mentioned him in several prophecies as a very prominent person who will one day have control over the entire earth. And the people who destroyed the city of Jerusalem back in 70 AD are the Roman people. And in all of Daniel's prophecies of the coming nations that will control the land of Israel, there are always two forms of the Roman Empire. And the second form, which will be ruled by this new prince, has not yet come on the scene. So in the future, we have that 70th week. And what does it start with? He, that prince, shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. One final group of 7 years, and there's this great big gap between the 69th and the 70th week. One final group of 7 years are designated for your people and for your holy city. And how does it start? This fellow that we know as Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, the beast, or the prince of the people who is to come, makes a peace treaty with the nation of Israel for 7 years. And for half of that week, or 3.5 of those years, he shall cause sacrifice and offering to cease. Now, he's not going to be making a treaty with Israel to cut off their sacrifices, because Israel's not going to sign that treaty. So it can't be in the first 3.5 years. It must be referring to the second half of the week, the second 3.5 years. And it leads me to believe that some charismatic world leader is going to be coming along, and he's going to say to Israel, I know how to get that piece of property for you where the Dome of the Rock is, so that you can build your temple and you can start doing sacrifices. And Israel will jump on that. And they will say, he's the man, he's the man. And many of them will be deceived. This prophecy implies at least a couple of things. Because you remember what happened after the Romans destroyed the city and the temple? Not only did sacrifice cease because there was no more temple, but the Jewish people were driven from the land. So this final treaty implies that Israel is back in the land and that they want a temple so that they can resume sacrifices. And that happens because 3.5 years into this treaty, this prince, this Antichrist guy says, nope, that's enough. No more sacrifice, no more offering, and upon the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Somehow the Antichrist does something to stop the sacrifices. It starts with a treaty and it ends with the abomination of desolation. But he doesn't tell us what it is. Jesus only gives us a hint. He says in Matthew chapter 24, so when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel, Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, standing in the holy place. Where is the holy place? That's the Holy of Holies. It's the innermost part of the temple to which the high priest could go, and he only once a year. But that still doesn't tell us exactly what that desolating sacrilege is. But Paul tells us over in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. The man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. And folks, that's why Jewish sacrifices halt, because now he says, I'm God. And that is the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. And after that, it says that Jesus Christ comes and destroys the Antichrist. The book of Revelation, chapters 4 through 19, discuss the events in detail of this last week of Daniel's prophecy, the last 7 years. But folks, we wouldn't know that if we did not know the prophecies of the Old Testament to give us the whole picture, the whole framework of how everything fits in and how the church age, the church is not Israel, the church age fits in that gap after the Christ is crucified, but before Antichrist makes a treaty with Israel. And we've got to get this perspective of Israel's prophetic history, because we will not understand the end if we don't understand Israel. There's a lot of stuff that we get wrong because of a failure to understand Israel's history and their future. So why are we doing an overview of the Old Testament? Because people don't see the particular stories. People don't see the prophetic framework. People don't see the person. If I asked you, where would I go in the Bible to read about Jesus? Well, you say, well, you need to start in the New Testament with the book of Matthew. Nope. You need to start in Genesis, chapter 1. Jesus himself said, you search the scriptures because you think in them that you have eternal life, and it is they, the scriptures, that bear witness of me. What's the Old Testament about? The Old Testament is about Jesus. In John chapter 1, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets, and that's one of the ways that the Jews described the Old Testament. They called it the law and the prophets. Jesus of Nazareth. So what were the law and the prophets? What were they writing about? Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said, if you believed Moses, and what did Moses write? At least the first 5 books of the Bible. If you believed Moses, you would believe me. Why? Because he wrote about me. Where do we go to find out about Jesus? Folks, we go to the Bible, and we start with the Old Testament. And because of a failure to understand this, the crucifixion and the resurrection of the Christ was a puzzle even to the disciples and a stumbling block to the rest of the nation. And this is why Jesus says to those disciples, you foolish men, slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And friends, I'm no Jesus, but in the next few months, I'm going to attempt to show you Jesus in the Old Testament, and to show that unless the Christ were to suffer and to die, to pay for my sins and to rise from the dead, I should never know